ashes at the Jack Daniel Distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee. But rather than dampen it, workers stoke it with an unusual fuel.
We're using 140 proof whiskey to start the fire because if we use gasoline or diesel or anything like that, it'll contaminate the charcoal. Each one of these stacks of wood is called a rick. It takes 16 ricks to fill a vat of charcoal.
To remove impurities from their whiskey, distillers at Jack Daniel's filter every drop of it through vats of sugar maple charcoal they manufacture on site.
This process is the one thing that we do manufacturing Jack Daniel's that distinguishes us from a bourbon.
This lone flavor modification makes Jack Daniel's a Tennessee straight whiskey and not a bourbon. Bourbon made with a majority of corn can't have any flavor modification. It's just distillate and water aged in oak barrels. The whiskey category is ripe with these kinds of subtle distinctions. There are Tennessee whiskeys, bourbons, Irish whiskeys, Canadian whiskeys, scotches, ryes, even a Colorado whiskey. Though distinct, they're all whiskeys because they have one thing in common.
Well, the main thing that differentiates whiskey from the other spirits in the world is the fact that whiskeys are made from grain.
A major grain producer, the United States is also the world's #2 producer of whiskey behind Scotland. Canada, Japan, and Ireland follow. Whiskey is the world's second most popular distilled spirit after vodka, and the U.S. consumes more of it than anyone else. Jack Daniel's holds the title of the world's #1 brand of whiskey, selling almost 24 million gallons per year. Most American whiskeys, like Jack Daniel's, fall into a subgroup called straight whiskey. To be designated a straight whiskey, a manufacturer must follow tight governmental guidelines.
When you're making a straight whiskey, it can only be distilled to no more than 160 proof, and it can't go into a barrel no more than 125 proof, and it has to be aged in new charred oak barrels for a minimum of 2 years. And on top of that, each style of straight whiskey has to have a major grain component. What makes one whiskey different from another is the type of grains that are used, the way that they're distilled, and how they're aged.
These differences lead to distinct flavor profiles, like that of Jack Daniel's. Ethan Kelly is a spirit sommelier, a trained expert in the hard stuff. At the Brandy Library in New York City, he oversees one of the country's most extensive whiskey collections. Ethan gives Jack a taste test.
When you nose this one, the wood does pop right out, and it is clear that you're, in a forest. You do get some very earthy qualities to it, almost farmhouse qualities. It's fatty, and it's earthy, and it's sweet.
That farmhouse quality comes from, well, the farm. Jack Daniel's starts with a recipe, also known as a grain bill, of 80% corn, 12% barley, and 8% rye. The distillery, located on this site since the 1860s, has its own water source that also influences flavor.
Jack Daniel purchased the whiskey making operation from a Lutheran minister in his early teens, but he located the manufacturing operation here because of a abundant limestone water. It's an iron-free water source that flows out of the cave at a constant 56 degrees year-round.
This lack of iron affects the fermentation process.
Yeast likes to have all of the metals present, a balanced diet. So what we've done is by supplying it with iron-free water, we tend to shift the fermentation just a little bit, and that shift is part of what makes Jack Daniel.
The grain and water are pumped into what's known as the mash cooker and cooked into a runny porridge. Temperatures of up to 210 degrees break down the walls of the grain, allowing water to soak the starches. Enzymes in the grain can then convert starches into sugars, readying them for fermentation. This mash is then transferred into 40,000-gallon fermenting vats, where for the next 3 to 5 days, yeast goes to work making alcohol.
All the agitation that you see here is strictly from the yeast acting on the fermentable sugars. And they start converting fermentable sugars to CO2 and ethanol. So when I see a bubble of CO2 in here, I've also got a bubble of ethanol that I've made.
Ethanol, the alcohol that the yeast converts from the grain sugars, reaches about 10% concentration by the end of fermentation. This alcoholic mash is now known as distiller's beer.
Distiller's beer is a little different than normal beer in that we ferment the whole grain. What we're doing here is we're pumping the distiller's beer to the top of the beer still at about 250 gallons a minute. We add the steam in the bottom of the still. When we do that, then the steam goes up through the column. There's a series of what we call stripping trays in here. Those stripping trays have several hundred holes in them.
The column of steam collides with the distiller's beer, vaporizing the more volatile alcohol which passes out the top of the still. The perforated trays allow the grain husks and water that had been stripped of alcohol to flow out of the bottom of the still. The final distillate is a clear grain alcohol.
Now this is 140 proof, and there's about 40 gallons a minute coming out of here. I've heard this called white dog, white mule, white lightning. It's just new whiskey.
Every drop of this new 140 proof whiskey will be filtered through one of 72 charcoal mellowing vats, producing as much as 80,000 gallons of filtered whiskey per day.
It takes the whiskey approximately 1 day to work its way down towards the bottom of the charcoal. This charcoal has very strong absorptive capabilities to bind some of the impurities that come off in the new whiskey through distillation.
Workers then pump the whiskey into new charred white oak barrels. Each barrel weighs in at 500 pounds and must be loaded into the maturation warehouse by hand.
Usually a good entry day is about 1,000 barrels. Just depends on, a lot of it depends on how the house is rolling.
The barrels won't roll easily if the warehouse has settled at a tilt. Workers take care to keep the barrel load in the warehouse even, since the pressures of more than 10 million pounds of whiskey can warp the structure.
We have 77 maturation warehouses where we currently have in storage about 1.7 million barrels.
During maturation, the whiskey commingles with the deliberately charred surface inside the oak barrel and gains all of its color and much of its flavor.
When you char the barrel, of course it will darken, it'll turn a dark black, but it will open up pores in that caramelized layer where the whiskey can actually penetrate into and extract those wood sugars out. At least half of the flavor of Jack Daniel's comes from the wood.
Once mature, the whiskey will end up in one of 3 Jack Daniel's products: Gentleman Jack, the standard black label, or single barrel. Black Label and Gentleman Jack both contain a mixture of many barrels, but the single barrel is just that, whiskey from one barrel. Single barrels are selected from the upper, hottest part of the maturation warehouse, where the whiskey ventures deeper into the oak.
What we look for color, a nice caramel color, what the content of alcohol is, and the overall maturity of the whiskey.
Selected barrels are then brought to the floor of the single barrel bottling facility.
It's approximately 240 bottles per barrel, depending on the barrel. That's around 40 cases.
Unlike wine, once whiskey is in the bottle, it ceases to mature. It will not get any better than the day it was bottled. In fact, once the bottle has been opened, it may get worse.
A whiskey will oxidize just like a wine or a beer does. It just doesn't do it as quickly. It gets dull, it gets boring. When my whiskey bottle gets down to about 1/4 left, I invite all my friends over and we get together and we drink it. And it guarantees a good supply of friends.
These kinds of connoisseur issues would have been foreign to America's first whiskey distillers, the colonists. They made whiskey for the most practical of reasons, to prevent their excess grains from spoiling.
It also concentrates the grain. I mean, it makes it easier to transport when you turn it into whiskey. And it got to the point where whiskey was actually like currency.
The unregulated whiskey trade flourished until 1791, when the new federal government decided to tax it to pay the debt for the Revolutionary War. Farmers revolted against the tax, turning the excise men away by force.
In 1794, George Washington actually had to send out the militia, the troops to quell the uprising, and he actually sent out more troops to stop the Whiskey Rebellion than he needed to actually defeat the British. And ironically, just 3 years after the Whiskey Rebellion, George Washington decided to make his own whiskey in Mount Vernon. And by 1799, in the year that George Washington died, he was the largest distiller in the United States.
At this same time, in the neighboring state of Kentucky, Jim Beam was getting its start. In the bourbon category, no brand sells more.
My family started making whiskey in 1795. Jacob Beam made his first barrel of whiskey in 1795 and sold it. He started our family in this business. 7 generations later, here I am.
The company bears the name of Fred No's great-grandfather.
Jim Beam was the 4th generation, and he was the one who got us back on the map after Prohibition.
The distillery can be found in Claremont, Kentucky, where faith and whiskey managed to keep company, and tradition means maintaining a culture, literally.
Okay, we're going into our jug yeast cooler room right now. This is where we're keeping our strain of jug yeast that's been around since Prohibition. How we do this is we keep our original strain and we inoculate our new formula with it. We make our new jug yeast each time, and that keeps our strain alive.
This yeast is the engine of the distillery. It produces every drop of alcohol that becomes bourbon. Quality control begins as the grain arrives at the distillery. Incoming corn must pass a battery of tests.
It can't be over 14% moisture. Bushel weight, it's got to be at least 54 pounds a bushel. It can't have aflatoxin in it.
Aflatoxin is a toxin produced by molds on grain that, if present, would glow under this ultraviolet light. In addition to being toxic, it affects the taste of the whiskey. The grains must be mostly whole and not broken into so-called fines. Once a grain has passed inspection, it's moved into massive bins.
These are holding bins where we run our grains from the holding bins into the house as needed.
From above, the distillery looks like a small city, a huge industrial undertaking. But for Fred No, bourbon is all about family.
You know, you kind of have to be part artist, part scientist. And I think my dad, Booker No, was probably the best there ever was at making bourbon.
Booker also anticipated the growth potential in the high-end bourbons, the so-called ultra-premiums. Higher proof, more mature, more expensive whiskeys.
Dad released his Booker's bourbon in 1987, and that's what got the whole ultra-premium line started for the whole bourbon industry. His Booker's bourbon broke the $50 barrier on a bottle of bourbon. Is bottled straight from the barrel, uncut, unfiltered, the way bourbon was 100 years ago, for people to sip and savor. I mean, that's what the thing about these bourbons. It takes us 7, 8, 9, 10 years to make it.
Beam makes 4 ultra premiums: Basil Hayden's, Baker's, Booker's, and the best-selling ultra premium bourbon in the world, Knob Creek.
This one's named for a little area down the road where Abraham Lincoln was born. Now, this bourbon stays in these barrels for 9 years.
So storage is an issue. Beam matures 1,800,000 barrels in 55 rack houses. The process of removing whiskey from the barrels, also known as dumping, takes place, not surprisingly, in the dump room.
He's pulling the bung out of the barrel. What that does, that enables us to put the vent tube in the barrel so we can get the whiskey out. That whiskey's removed from the barrel and it goes straight into the trough through the piping into a tank.
Once emptied, the barrels are sold. They can only be used once for bourbon.
We get done with these barrels, we sell a lot of them to our friends over in Scotland to make the scotch. Scotch is okay because it's got some of my bourbon in the barrels we sell.
For Fred No, sampling bourbon straight out of the barrel is his favorite part of the job.
This is what we call a thief. This is how we steal a little drink of liquor out of these barrels. I just drop it in here. There's a hole on top. Put my thumb on it good and tight. And then I'll bring it out here. And then I'll get a little shot of liquor. What I'm doing there is the Kentucky chew. Put the bourbon in your mouth and chew on it a little bit. And what it does, it involves your entire mouth in the tasting.
For those who take their bourbon seriously, these are good times.
People are drinking less and they want to drink better. It's got the bourbon business rocking and rolling again.
While business is booming for distillers in the American South, an ocean away in the birthplace of whiskey, a liquid gold rush is going on as well. Dublin, one of the fastest growing and most youthful capitals in Europe, is experiencing a renaissance. Jameson, founded in 1780, like Dublin, is in the midst of its own resurgence.
10 years ago, we would have distilled somewhere in the order of maybe 12 million litres of pure alcohol per annum. Currently, we're distilling 25 million litres. It's a very exciting time to be involved in the Jameson story in Ireland.
Part of this excitement is coming from reaching a new, younger customer.
It would have been the case not too many years ago that they would have regarded whisky as maybe an older person's beverage, and that is not the case with Jameson.
Jameson's smooth taste profile is key to its growing appeal.
The best whiskeys evolve on the palate as you're tasting it. And this is the Jameson 18-year-old, and this is an outstanding blended Irish whiskey. It's a nice silky texture to it, lots of toffee and fruit, a little bit of nuttiness, some of that cereal grain. It's continuing to evolve, fading on to a nice, soft, malty finish.
This accessible yet complex blended whiskey is produced by an Irish whiskey industry that is highly consolidated. The island has only 3 major distilleries, Bushmills, Cooley, and Middleton, but they produce roughly 30 different whiskeys. Jameson's old distillery in Middleton, dating back to the 1820s, is now a visitor center and serves as a graceful facade for the very industrial guts of the operation, the working distillery built in the 1970s. 2 grains fuel this concrete and steel behemoth: corn distilled into a pure grain alcohol almost like a vodka, and for flavor, barley.
It gives it a very smooth flavor on the palate, and it also gives it like a silky and serumy mouthfeel, and that's what the barley does in the mash.
To provide the sugars necessary for fermentation, the barley has been soaked in water in order to induce it to malt or germinate.
What you're doing is really fooling the barley grain into thinking it's going to grow up into a barley plant. So you're allowing it to access the starchy reservoir within the grain.
Once these sugars have been extracted from the malted barley in the brewhouse, they are pumped into gigantic fermentation vats.
Up here we have our fermentation vats, 32 in total, each containing 200,000 litres of fermenting beer or fermenting wash. Yeast is added, and it is here that the yeast will convert with that rich sugary liquid into alcohol and also into a whole range of fantastic flavours. This is the still house of the Jameson Distillery. Behind me here we have the first pot still. The alcoholic vapours, along with all of the volatile flavour compounds, rise up through the neck of the still, across the line arm, and gets condensed back into a liquid again. This liquid is known as low wines, and it contains about 20 to 40% alcohol by volume. This low wines is then pumped into the second pot still here. Again, heat is applied, the alcoholic vapours rise up through the neck of the still. The strength at this stage has been increased to about 70% alcohol by volume, is then taken and put into the third still. Triple distillation has always been type of distillation used in Ireland, and that's because it produces a particular character and a particular style of distillate. What it really does is that it removes some of the heaviness to allow you to push the flavour spectrum more into the floral and fruity, spicy and fragrant characteristics.
The Jameson blend is a combination of these pot-stilled whiskies and lighter grain whiskey.
Grain whiskey, it's essentially from corn, what we call maize, distilled in column stills. So it comes off the still at quite a high alcoholic strength, and it's got a more lighter style.
This lighter whiskey is aged in bourbon barrels that have already been used several times.
Now here we see inside of what a bourbon barrel looks like.
Whiskey barrels are porous. In the summer months, as the whiskey warms up, pressure builds inside the barrel. The whiskey penetrates the oak, absorbing both the wood's flavors and its amber color.
It's more than just a maturation, but it's almost like a melding of flavors.
The charred oak is saturated with 20 pounds of bourbon. Both oak and bourbon contribute to Jameson's flavor.
We don't use any virgin oak in our whiskey production because the heavy extracts from the virgin oak would be too heavy for the light distillate that we produce here in Middleton.
Pot still whiskey is also aged in a refill oak barrel.
It's one that's been used 2 or 3 times. And the whiskey that comes out of such a barrel allows more of the distillate character to be retained.
But Jameson ages some of its whiskey in sherry casks, which are 2.5 times bigger than standard oak barrels.
You can take that same whiskey and mature it in a sherry cask. And you can see here that the color is quite different. And that's because Spanish oak has a higher level of oak extract and tannin.
The sherry butts are very much different from our bourbon barrel. They're seasoned with sherry wine for 2.5 years before they come home to be used here in the distillery. The sherry gives you a nutty taste, honey notes, gives you a nice, deep, chestnutty colour to the spirit. In our warehouses here in Middleton, we would have circa 650,000 casks. We are filling approximately 175,000 casks a year, and we're dumping about 130,000 casks a year.
But not all of the whiskey that goes into the barrels will make it into a bottle because of what's known as the angel share.
When the alcohol is expanding, it's pushing out into the oak and evaporating off. So we lose about 2.2, 2.3% per annum to the angel share.
This most modern and sophisticated of products has roots in Irish monasteries, like this one at Glendalough, in County Wicklow. Irish monks made whiskey at sites like these perhaps as early as 1,000 years ago.
Whiskey was invented here in Ireland. Missionary monks from Ireland went out to preach Christianity in Europe. They discovered in the East an alembic, a pot still, a distillation vessel. And they brought this back to Ireland. It had been used for perfume. They found a much better use for it, and they began to distill whiskey. Whiskey, they called it with the Gaelic name Ishkabaha, the water of life.
Today, Ishkabaha, or whiskey, is being produced in quantities the Irish monks could never have imagined. At Jameson, once the whiskey is matured, the finished product is shipped from the distillery in Middleton to Dublin for bottling.
Here at the Jameson bottling plant, we're running all week, every week of the year. We're producing about 1 million bottles a week. In total, between 40 and 50 million bottles every year.
In Ireland, a single distillery produces a variety of whiskies for its own blends. But in Scotland, competing distilleries have developed a surprising system to achieve their complex blends. Scotland is a small country with a giant presence in the global whiskey industry. It has roughly 90 distilleries, more than any other whiskey-producing country on Earth. And whiskey is Scotland's largest export, grossing almost $6 billion per year. It was global interest in Scotland's single malt scotches in the 1980s and 1990s that revived a whiskey category that had been in decline for decades. Scotland's single malt scotches are some of the most expensive, sought-after whiskies in the world.
Single means it's the product of just one distillery. Malt means that it's made exclusively from malted barley. And Scotch means it has to be distilled and matured in Scotland in oak barrels for a minimum of 3 years.
Here at the Glenlivet Distillery, we only produce one whiskey, and that is the Glenlivet single malt. The Glenlivet is the world's #2 single malt whiskey.
A single malt like the Glenlivet may be sold on its own, or as part of a blended whiskey, like Chivas Regal. Despite Scotland's reputation for single malts, 90% of its whiskies are sold as blends, which are more accessible to the tastes of the average consumer.
When we create a blended whisky, you have to use about 30 single malts. So we're constantly exchanging whiskies with some of our competitor companies.
Most Scottish distilleries only distill one Scotch, their own single malt. As a result, they must rely on other distilleries to contribute Scotches to their blend. There's a great deal of diversity to Scotch whiskies.
There are 4 recognised whisky-making regions. Firstly, in the south of Scotland, an area known as the Lowlands. And the whiskies from the Lowlands tend to be very soft and gentle in their characteristic. Then we have a little island on the west coast of Scotland known as Islay. And the whiskies from Islay are very smoky, very pungent, very distinctive.
The West Coast whiskies get their smoke from peat.
The distilleries on the West Coast traditionally have always used peat to dry their malted barley. And when you burn the peat, it gives off a very distinctive smoke. This clings to the malted barley, and in turn it flavours the whisky. Then we have a huge geographic region known as the Highlands, and the malt whiskies from the Highlands tend to be fruity and spicy in their characteristic. Here on Speyside, the greatest of all of the 4 whisky-making regions, the whiskies from Speyside tend to be sweet and floral and fruity in their characteristics.
Hundreds of years ago, the Speyside region was known as a haven for illegal distillers.
After the Battle of Culloden in 1746, where the English heavily defeated the Scots, the English taxed the making of Scotch whisky to such an extent that the Scots couldn't make it legally. So they all began making it illegally.
They used portable stills like this one that could be moved if soldiers showed up.
This is the size of still that you'd have saw the illegal distillers using. It would have been filled with that mixture of sweet liquids, the wort that they used as the first stage of the process. It would have been boiled up inside here, and then you'd have watched the vapours coming over here. As it goes down through the coil and the cold water, it's going to condense back into a liquid again before appearing out the funnel at the end.
Today, water is still key to the operation of the distillery.
We'll use probably in the region of 3 million litres of water a day in between mashing, cooling, condensing.
The distillery also consumes 40 tons of malted or germinated barley a day. Glenlivet is made from 100% barley.
And this is the mash tun. And this is where we start to extract the sugars and the starches that we're going to make into alcohol. And the way we do that is we fill 12 tons of grist into this vessel.
Hot water extracts the sugars, and then this liquid, the wort, is pumped into the fermenters.
Into each of these, 60,000 litres of liquid will come through from the mash tun, and then we'll add 215 kilos of yeast, and that creates a 100% natural process. So this is where we create the alcohol.
After 2 days, the 8.5% beer is ready for double distillation. That's very similar to Jameson's triple distillation process. Surprisingly, the entire distillery is monitored by only 2 people and banks of computers. Though computers have a large hand in making it, the Glenlivet has a sensual appeal.
Wonderfully soft, wonderfully rounded and rich on the nose. And it just is beautiful. It just goes down so gently, warming all the way. On a cold morning here at Glenlivet Distillery, this is central heating, as it should be.
Single malt scotches are the world's most expensive whiskies. Glenlivets range from their 12-year-old, which costs $35, to the Glenlivet 25-year-old, which will set you back $350. To the Glenlivet Cellar Collection 1964 limited edition, with only 1,824 bottles produced, which goes for a tidy $2,000 a bottle. And Scotch prices for rare bottles just go up from there. One of the world's most expensive bottles of whiskey, a 1926 Macallan Scotch, was purchased for $75,000 in Seoul, South Korea. How does a bottle of Scotch command this kind of price tag?
Rarity. number one, is remarkably important. Are you drinking, in fact, a piece of history? Two is the historical significance. If we're going to drink that old, did this define a category or did it not?
Why are people buying these $300, $400, $500 or and up whiskeys? It's a lot easier to go out and buy a $300 bottle of whiskey than it is a $40,000 sports car or a $600,000 vacation home. You know, it's an affordable luxury. It's a beautiful thing.
Those Scotch whiskey distillers historically had their struggles with the law. In this country, just north of the United States, distillers flourished because of a law: prohibition. A country's most prized products often reflect the personality of its people. Canadian whiskeys, mostly blends of rye and neutral grain spirits, underscore the easy nature of both Canada and its whiskey.
Canadian whiskey is probably the lightest and most delicate and easiest to embrace whiskey of all the major whiskey producing countries.
Canada's distillers, the world's #3 producers of whiskey, make almost 48 million gallons of whiskey per year. The Canadian national style originated in 1884 with the introduction of one of the country's best-known whiskeys, Canadian Club. The Canadian Club Classic 12-year-old is the company's most mature expression of its flavor profile.
What we do get is vanilla, and lots of it. You do get some of that grainy character from the rye. That is all the way through an enjoyable, pleasant drink.
The lightness of Canadian Club comes from its base whiskey, a corn distillate with no color. It may comprise as much as 80 to 90% of the volume, and unlike U.S. bourbons, has almost all of the corn's grainy flavor distilled out of it. The whiskey blends of other countries like Scotland and Ireland contain less of this neutral base whiskey and tend to have a more aggressive taste. Canadian Club's flavoring component is distilled from fermented rye, rye malt, and barley malt.
To be called a Canadian whiskey, the government has set forth rules and regulations. For example, we have to use a variety of different grains. It has to be manufactured and aged here in Canada for a minimum of 3 years. And similar to the Scottish and Irish distillers, we're able to use our barrels several times.
At Canadian Club, those barrels are once-used bourbon barrels purchased from the U.S.
Well, we Canadians get to use our barrels several times, therefore attributing to a lighter oak flavor profile product.
The Canadian Club line features 4 different whiskeys.
There's our standard 6-year-old Canadian Club, which is available in 151 countries around the world. CC Reserve, our 10-year-old format, is our premium version. The super premium Classic 12 by Canadian Club, and of course, CC Sherry Cask.
Canadian Club owes its tradition of elegant whiskeys to its founder, Hiram Walker. He worked in what is now the Canadian Club Heritage Center.
So we're now in the Canadian Club's founding father's office, Hiram Walker. Mr. Hiram Walker came to Canada in 1856, and in 1858 he opened the distillery. This is actually Hiram Walker's desk, where he used to conduct business on a daily basis.
A U.S. citizen, Walker opened his distillery in Windsor, Ontario, across the river from his home in Detroit, because he feared the growing power of the temperance movement in the U.S. He may have been off by 60 years, but in 1920, when Prohibition hit the U.S., Walker's sons had inherited the company. They found eager distributors of their Canadian whiskey, the Purple Gang, who were mostly Jewish mobsters out of Detroit, as well as the Chicago Mob.
When Prohibition entered into the U.S. in 1920, the boys from the Purple Gang out of downtown Detroit would come over here to conduct business. Mr. Capone himself would conduct business at this table with the Hiram Walker boys. And this became known as the Speakeasy, which is still what we're using it for today.
The mile-wide Detroit River separates Detroit from Windsor, Ontario. During Prohibition, smugglers made the short trip across to Canada, loaded up with Canadian Club, and then distributed the product to a thirsty U.S. populace. People came across the Detroit River by boat. Or during winter freezes, it became an ice road for smugglers.
The sales of Canadian Club rose drastically during Prohibition.
But since mobsters had a hand in distribution, shipments were often hijacked. A system of coded telegrams was developed to throw thieves off the trail.
This one's dated July 31st, 1931. Just above it, they uncoded it. We have 300 cases of Club have left on its way to London, so this became very, very popular way of transporting product.
One Canadian Club bottle, known as the Prohibition bottle, was a favorite with drinkers.
It's concave in the back. The guys would slip it into their pockets and the ladies were strapping it on their leg, and this bottle kind of hugs your body. Another name for this bottle was known as the bootlegger bottle. The reason for that is ladies back then used to wear long gowns and the boots had straps in them. They would strap these bottles to their leg, thus came the term bootlegger.
Canadian Club's whiskeys were known then, as they are now, for being cocktail friendly.
My favorite cocktail is what I've called the Millionaire's Manhattan, a measure and a half of Canadian Club Classic 12-year-old. Next, add a half a measure of Harvey's Bristol Cream. And last but not least, garnish it with a couple of maraschino cherries. The Millionaire's Manhattan.
Canadian whiskeys express a distinct national character that has little in common with U.S. whiskeys. And in the U.S., there's a growing micro-distillery movement that's not afraid to innovate. But what exactly does a gas pump have to do with whiskey? So what does it take to start your own micro-distillery and make your own whiskey? For the team at Stranahan's Whiskey in Denver, Colorado, it took some cash. $500,000 in seed money, and also a strong desire to work with their hands.
Here at Stranahan's, we do everything by hand, so we actually hand write the labels, we hand bottle everything.
And it helps to have friends.
Tomorrow we'll do about 25 to 3,000 bottles. We have volunteers come in and help us.
And yes, you have to like whiskey.
So, salute, buddy. Man, that's good.
Stranahan's Colorado Whiskey is at the vanguard of a micro-distilling movement that over the last 20 years has seen scores of new distilleries opening across the United States. In part, this is due to relaxed regulation on alcohol production at the state level. States are increasingly turning to distilled spirits to generate much-needed tax revenue. But it's not legal to distill at home, mostly because alcohol is highly flammable and presents a fire hazard.
Well, micro-distilling is growing very rapidly right now, kind of following the same path that the microbrew beers followed. It's a rebellion against the homogenization of America.
So in the midst of so much sameness comes something a little out of the norm, a Rocky Mountain whiskey.
We're the first straight American whiskey to be made of 100% malted barley.
Mashing, pasteurizing, and fermenting all take place next door to Stranahan's at the Flying Dog Brewery.
So you use a lot of the same type of equipment and a lot of the same gear. So it was a good fit to hire a established microbrewery to ferment our recipe. Otherwise, we'd have to purchase all this equipment ourselves.
It only takes one of the brewery's 40 fermenting tanks to satisfy Stranahan's needs.
Here we are, we're hanging on for dear life on fermenting vessel number 4. This is where we're going to add the yeast, and the magic will happen. Each batch is about 3,000 gallons, and so that's what we'll distill over a week's time.
Flying Dog ferments our recipe to our specs and then pipes it over the roof.
The freshly fermented beer, also known as wash, is ready to be distilled in Stranahan's custom-designed still.
They're unique in design in the fact that the bottom part of the still is a pot still. All right, and that's like Scotch. Scotch is generally made in a pot still in a batch. The upper part of the still is a column still. We're using kind of bourbon technology up on top and Scotch technology in the bottom. We were the first people to use this. What we're trying to do is create a spirit that kind of takes on features of both types of distillate.
Each batch of whiskey takes 18 hours to distill.
That's why it's known as a batch process, because we're going to fill up our wash still with 750 gallons of wash. Once we distill out all the alcohol that's in there, we're going to drain it and refill it again.
The barrel filler is ingeniously enough, a modified gas pump.
We're going to take our handy-dandy barrel filler, specific only to Stranahan's Colorado whiskey, and we're going to fill our new American white oak heavy charred barrel. We fill this up. We're going to roll it back into our warehouse. Our rack house is unique in that we are a heated and humidified facility here. In the wintertime, we're hot in here, and in the summertime, it's Hades in here. It gets to be about 110. So we have the 2 seasons to help force the whiskey in and out of the wood. So actually, our aging process is a little more rapid than most other distillers use. Right now, we're producing an average of 6 barrels a week.
That's roughly 720 bottles of whiskey a week. But is the whiskey world better off for having a Colorado whiskey? We went back to the Brandy Library in Lower Manhattan to find out.
I'm a little excited about this one because I have yet to even come across it. It's almost orange, eye-catching right off the start. And the fruit pops. And wow, that's impressive. That's very impressive. There's something cinnamon about it, spicy and fresh. That is a lovely dram. That is a perfect example of what can be done with just a little bit of ingenuity.
And after all, it seems fitting that Colorado would produce a whiskey.
We didn't have John Wayne walk into a bar in Colorado and say, "Hey, Pard, how about a mango-infused vodka and make it a double?" He went in and he asked for a whiskey. That's what the miners and the cowboys drank.
Cheers.
Good to see you.
Whiskey is, without a doubt, the most complex and diverse spirit being produced on the face of this earth.
And as whiskey producers make an ever-increasing variety of whiskeys, there are more and more good times to drink them.
People get this misconception that whiskey is an after-dinner drink, and that's the only time you should drink it. What they don't realize is that there's some great whiskeys that go with a meal. There's some great aperitif whiskeys. There's some great afternoon whiskeys, and there's some great mid to late morning whiskeys, too.
Now there's a concept. Whiskey with your coffee break.